When it comes to roguelike shooters, we aren't exactly spoiled for choice. Gunfire Reborn has been at the top of this specific genre for quite some time, but slowly creeping up the ranks and getting more recognition is Roboquest. Now, Roboquest is still in early access, set to release sometime this year, I believe, so we can't exactly compare the two fairly at the moment, but I will make the initial comparison of the mechanics. Mechanically, Roboquest blows Gunfire Reborn out of the water. I mean, just look at the gameplay I'm showing you and tell me the mechanics don't look infinitely better than Gunfire's. In Roboquest, movement and weapon feedback are given the love that they need. I mentioned this in my roguelike video, but if you're going to make an FPS roguelike, then you better make the shooting incredible, considering that that's what we'll be doing 99% of the time. Rise Up Studios clearly understands this, as movement and shooting are the highlights of Roboquest. In fact, I think we'll start there. Movement and shooting, the two most invaluable features of any shooter. Doesn't matter how good the game looks, how deep the progression is, or how good the story is, if the shooting isn't fun in a shooter, then what's the point? Weapon feedback in Roboquest reminds me a lot of Borderlands 3's weapon mechanics, which I really enjoyed. They were without a doubt the best in the series. So for me, that's it. The feedback is what makes the weapons feel good to use. In Roboquest, the recoil isn't high, but that fits for the pace of the game, and there is enough recoil to know that the gun you're using packs a punch, and I think that response is important. Also, the sound of hitting an enemy and hitting critical hits are satisfying, and we all know how important that is. Not to mention the animation quality and effects of the weapons, which are done well too. Moving on to movement, which is also very satisfying in Roboquest. There isn't an extensive amount of tools for movement, but sometimes simplicity is king. Movement speed is well balanced with the complementary double jump, slide, and the ability to rail grind around the level, and the actual feel of the movement is a nice balance between weight, float, and speed, so that actually moving around the environments remains at the same pace that the rest of the game is going at. These two features are easily the highlight of the game, and again, that's incredibly important when that's what you are going to be doing 99% of the time. Let's talk about the number of weapons and gear at your disposal, both of which have been constantly increasing as updates have rolled out. I really love the variety of weapons in Roboquest: rocket launchers, snipers, energy weapons, etc, etc. They take the approach of having set weapons with their own identity, but then tag a ton of modifiers onto these weapons to change up how they work. These come in the form of simple stat boosts, fire rate increases, or crazier things like firing rockets every few shots. They can also come with an alternate fire mode. Every weapon I have used has felt useful, and while you'll certainly learn to favor some weapons, I feel like the gap in usability or damage isn't that wide. And all weapons can be upgraded throughout your run, so if you found one early on that you like, you can keep it for the whole run, and if you don't like the affixes on your gun, you can reroll those as well. When it comes to gear, it's all about the class you choose. There are 4 at the moment, and they all have unique passives and actives. I usually go for the Commando, who shoots a rocket and can utilize a shotgun in place of a melee attack. I'll run through the run-based progression in a moment, but on the same menu as class select, you can also apply different pieces of gear that give you a certain bonus. It's an extra piece of utility, really, and I will say I think the extra pieces of utility could definitely have more of an impact in the run than they currently do, so boosting their effectiveness would achieve that, and this would all be in service of making builds rather than just equipping boring minor pieces of gear that assist in small ways. But the classes which you will be building based upon their strengths do feel good, and one doesn't feel more powerful than the other, in my opinion. Okay, so let's talk about what happens in the run. When you start your run, depending on what you've upgraded, you'll have a couple different weapon choices, and then you are off to the races. Each stage mimics the last, except for the last two, but we'll get there, in that you run through enemies, go and do the challenge, pass through some rooms with even more choices to upgrade and the ability to spend some earned currency, and then you get to the boss. You finish the boss, rinse and repeat on the next couple of stages until you get to Haven City. Haven City is a more open stage with chests and upgrades to find. To complete it, you'll need to beat 4 bosses that spawn in the stage to move on to Corrupted Haven City, which is a smaller stage where you'll need to beat 2 challenges to unlock the door to get to the last boss that's currently in the game. If I do everything, the run usually takes me about 30 to 40 minutes, but you can definitely decrease that time immensely, as you could technically run past all the optional bits. Regardless, I do like the environmental work. I wouldn't say it's anything special, but it's passable and each stage feels visually unique. I will say that they do an excellent job at not letting the pace slip. You have your quiet moments, but only when you actually want them. The rest of the run is non-stop action, and nothing feels out of place either about the runs. Maybe because the runs aren't incredibly deep, so there isn't any element that could feel wasted or out of place within them, but without a doubt, you'll be engaged for the full run. Progression in the run is done well, nothing exceptional, but with some upgrades to base camp, you'll start to get a lot of options when it comes to upgrades in the run. Initially, it's definitely pretty linear, but as you progress, more and more opens up to you, and in those quiet moments, you are given choices to make that do matter. You'll get free weapons and upgrade choices, of course, but also paid ones. So one thing I can say is that you'll never be starved for choice. As I said, the choices do matter, and that's mostly due to the fact that most, not all, but most upgrades have impact or utility. This is especially the case with the level up rewards, which are your most powerful form of reward, and impact your class's abilities directly or provide a more powerful buff elsewhere. When I first started playing Roboquest, the type of in-run progression was pretty clear to me, and it bored me a little at first, but now that we're nearing release, hopefully, the progression style has remained the same. They've just done an awesome job at expanding upon it. It also mimics the rest of the game in that it is quite simple. There aren't many layers to it, but that's not the worst thing. I certainly wouldn't mind more layers of progression in and out of the run, but what we have now works well enough. To continue on that note, out-of-run progression is solely in the form of wrenches that you get in your runs that are used to upgrade base camp. This is fine for now, but hopefully on release there are more layers of meta progression, because as soon as I've maxed this out, I may lose motivation to play. Now, in a game like this, one might argue that the soundtrack is as important as everything else. Well, holy shit, the soundtrack is fucking incredible. Noise Cream, the composer, absolutely nails it. Not only are these tracks entertaining to listen to on their own, but they perfectly complement the gameplay. In the quiet moments I was talking about, they loop the build-up of the song, and as soon as you open the door, it drops, so it's fun to time the drop to you opening the door. Early on in my gaming career, I was so unaware of how much of a difference a good soundtrack can make, but it's clear to me now how impactful they can be. I have nothing else to say about it other than that it is a great soundtrack, and again, Noise Cream kills it. If you don't end up playing Roboquest, I humbly ask that you listen to the tracks on Spotify anyway and give Noise Cream some recognition. Something else crucial to a game like this is the boss fights, and they don't miss with these either. Each boss is not only unique in its attack pattern and look, but the arenas are also a huge part of the experience. It's a part I don't want to spoil all of. I'll show one or two in the background, but I don't want to ruin your first experience with some of them. Not all of the arenas are special, but it's nice that they went to the extra effort to make sure that these boss fights kept the pace up and were more engaging than just shoot and dodge. As far as I'm aware, the boss you get is determined by where you choose to go on each of the stages, beside the last two, but I'm not entirely sure on that. Either way, good job on the bosses. I generally think that Roboquest is simpler than it needs to be. I think many games can add layers of complexity without making the game frustratingly complicated. I mentioned that simplicity is king, and I stand by that, but that's also mostly in reference to fundamental mechanics like movement and shooting. So many games complicate fundamental mechanics that they end up taking away from them rather than complementing them. That isn't Roboquest, and I think Roboquest's fundamentals are really solid, so now it's time to add layer after layer of replayability so that on release, people who've been playing it since early access have something to do, and people who buy the game on release don't end up with just a 20-hour game. A potential issue I see people having is with the robots themselves. Now, I'm not arguing that enemies you fight in shooters need to have any sort of personality, but in games like Borderlands, it helps to know that what you're shooting has at least one iota of personality or character. In fact, this is where I'll give credit to Gunfire. The enemy design in that game isn't anything special, but it's enough to assign a certain level of familiarity to these enemies. In Roboquest, the basic enemies you fight may as well just be stock assets being used for testing of the game. Okay, it's not that bad, but for some people the grey and red color palette and similar bodywork of each enemy might mean that it's hard to be engaged in combat. For me, it isn't an issue, and the boss fights have a lot more personality than the regular enemies. I also do have to say that I think they understand this, and it's kind of clear to me that with some enemies they've played around with the aesthetic of a robot and tried to make it more interesting, but yeah, it's just something I thought I should mention. Anyway, I wanted to make a video on Roboquest because I thought it deserved a lot of love. Fundamentally, the game is superb, and the soundtrack makes running through each level an elevated experience. While it lacks complexity in progression in and out of runs to some degree, I'm sure it won't stay that way forever. Thank you so much for watching. Follow me on Twitch to catch me live when my internet isn't being a dick. Follow me on Twitter, and see you later.